November 27, 1950. The Korean War was raging and winter had turned the mountains into a frozen graveyard. Thousands of shivering, half-starved American soldiers were marching through the snow, not toward battle or to their homeland, but straight into captivity. Their captors labeled them war criminals and sent them to re-education camps designed to break them without bullets. How do you destroy a soldier without pulling a trigger? This is the story of what happens when an enemy's primary goal is not to kill you, but to methodically erase the man you were, your loyalties, your beliefs, your very identity, and rebuild you as something else. The North Korean guards had an entire system to achieve this. They divided their American students into two groups: the progressives, who would be rewarded for collaboration, and the reactionaries, who would be marked for a special, calculated hell. This is the story of that hell. The death marches, the great filth. For thousands of American POWs, the first lesson in their new reality was taught on a frozen road, where every step was a choice, and the curriculum was written in the snow with the bodies of the fallen. The story of the North Korean prison camp experience begins in the brutal, unforgiving winter of 1950. Following the massive intervention of Chinese forces, entire American divisions, particularly around the Chosin Reservoir and along the Yalu River, were shattered, encircled, and captured in catastrophic numbers. For these men, the shock of surrender, an act they had never contemplated, was immediately eclipsed by the horror of what came next. There would be no trucks to a central processing center, no adherence to the Geneva Convention they had been told would protect them. There was only the march. These forced marches, which survivors would forever refer to as death marches, were not a mere logistical transfer of prisoners. They were the first and most brutal stage of the enemy's program. It was merciless filter designed to physically and mentally tenderize the captives, to weed out the weak, and to deliver to the permanent camps only those who had been thoroughly conditioned by trauma. Private Earl C. Brody, captured in the initial onslaught, was one of thousands herded into these shuffling columns of despair. They were forced to walk south, then north, deeper and deeper into enemy territory, often for weeks, covering hundreds of miles. They marched with little to no food, wearing the same summer weight uniforms they had been captured in, now wholly inadequate against the savage Korean winter where temperatures regularly plunged to 30 degrees below zero. The guards who oversaw these marches were a mix of North Korean and Chinese soldiers, known contemptuously by the POWs as the goons. They were far from passive overseers. They were weapons of a policy of slow destruction. The prisoners were already suffering from wounds, shock, and frostbite. Even then, the guards showed no mercy. To stumble from exhaustion was to invite a sharp, violent blow from a rifle butt. To fall and be unable to rise was a death sentence. Survivor testimonies, collected over decades, paint a chillingly consistent and gruesome picture. Any man left behind would either be left to freeze, or a guard would end it quickly. One of the most feared figures on these marches was a North Korean officer, Major Chong Myong-sil. The prisoners nicknamed him the Tiger. He was a man who seemed to embody the casual cruelty of the entire system. In one infamous incident, the Tiger stopped a column and walked to the back, where an American lieutenant, John Thornton, was struggling. He asked Thornton what the U.S. Army did when a man fell behind. Thornton replied that they would send men back to help him. The Tiger responded, "In our army, we shoot them." He then placed a handkerchief over the lieutenant's face and shot him in the head. By the end of that particular march, survivors estimated the cost had been a man a mile in casualties. Food was not just scarce, it was a weapon. At times, the guards gave out a small ball of millet or sorghum, which was almost impossible to digest. This was often the only meal for an entire day of grueling marching. The men became walking skeletons. Their uniforms, once a symbol of pride, hung off their emaciated frames like rags. They were consumed by a primal, all-encompassing hunger. They chewed on tree bark, ate frozen grass, and scoured the ground for insects. To be caught doing so was to risk a savage beating for breaking discipline. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. The guards deliberately fostered a state of absolute hopelessness. This was the true purpose of the Death March. It was the first stage of the re-education, which was designed to shatter their identity as soldiers of a powerful army and reduce them to a primal state of individual survival. By the time the skeletal survivors stumbled into the permanent camps along the Yalu River, they were not a cohesive military unit ready to resist. They were a shattered, traumatized collection of individuals, already conditioned by weeks of terror to fear, to feel helpless, and to understand the absolute and lethal authority of their captors. The filter had done its work. The architecture of hell, camps of engineered despair. For the men who survived the Death March, reaching the camp was a descent into a new, more permanent circle of hell. They had been brought to a place engineered not just to hold their bodies, but to systematically dismantle their will to live. The North Korean POW camp system was not a single, centralized location. It was a scattered landscape of misery, filled with a network of camps with names that would forever be remembered by those who endured them. Camp 1 at Changsong, Camp 3 at Changni, and the largest and most notorious, the collection of camps around the village of Pyeongtaung, known simply as Camp 5. These were not camps in the traditional military sense. There were no wooden barracks or watchtowers. Instead, the Chinese and North Koreans repurposed entire Korean villages, turning the humble mud brick huts of peasant families into prisons. This seemingly primitive setup was a key part of the camp's insidious design. The first and most relentless assault was on the senses and the body. The living conditions was a calculated strategy to weaken the prisoners and make them more susceptible to the psychological warfare to come. Men were crammed into the small, filthy, unheated huts, sometimes 200 people in a room designed for a small family. They slept on the cold, hard dirt floors, packed together like sardines in a can. There was no room to stretch, no space for personal belongings, no concept of privacy. To turn over at night meant waking a dozen other men. Lice were a constant, maddening plague. They infested everything, including the seams of their ragged uniforms, their hair, and the thin, dirty blankets they were sometimes given. The prisoners called them seam squirrels. The constant, inescapable itching was a form of low-level, continuous torture that distracted men and robbed them of sleep. Even worse, the lice carried deadly diseases. Epidemics of typhus, a brutal fever-inducing illness, swept through the crowded huts in deadly waves, killing men who were already too weak to fight it off. Sanitation was a concept that simply did not exist. The latrines were often just open trenches located near the huts, which would quickly overflow with filth. During the rains, this raw sewage would wash through the camp, contaminating the ground and the prisoners' only source of water. This led to the camp's most effective and prolific killer, dysentery. The disease, in its various amoebic and bacterial forms, was a death sentence in slow motion. It caused severe bloody diarrhea that ripped the nutrients from the men's body and left them utterly dehydrated. In their weakened state, men would soil themselves where they lay, unable to even crawl to the latrine trench. With no medicine, clean water, or sanitation, dysentery spread quickly, turning the huts into death traps. The guards viewed this not as a public health crisis to be managed, but as a natural feature of the system. It was another tool of attrition. Starvation was the central pillar of life and control in the camps. The total caloric intake was scientifically engineered to be just below the level required to sustain human life over a prolonged period. This chronic, gnawing hunger had a profound and transformative effect on the prisoners. It reduced their world to a single, all-consuming obsession: food. Men would talk about it, dream about it, and fantasize about meals they had eaten years ago. They would risk savage beatings to steal a single potato from the cookhouse or to catch a snake in the fields. This obsession served a dual purpose for the guards. First, it kept the prisoners physically weak, lethargic, and incapable of mounting any organized resistance or escape attempts. Second, and more importantly, it was a powerful psychological tool. It focused a man's entire consciousness inward, on his own desperate, animalistic need to survive. It eroded the bonds of brotherhood as men were tempted to steal food from their comrades. A man whose entire universe has shrunk to the size of his next bowl of millet is a man who is easy to control. Medical care in the camps was nothing but a cruel joke. The hospitals were simply designated death huts, where the sickest and most hopeless cases were sent to die, out of sight of the general population. There were no medicines, no bandages, no sterile equipment. The few American military doctors who had been captured did everything they could, but with no supplies, they were rendered helpless. They were healers with nothing to heal. They could only watch in impotent fury as men died from treatable battle wounds that became gangrenous, from pneumonia, and from the horrifying diseases of severe malnutrition. They saw men waste away from pellagra as their skin cracked and peeled, and they saw others die of beriberi as their bodies swelled with fluid until their hearts stopped. They watched them die from night blindness, scurvy, and a host of other ailments that had been eradicated in the developed world for decades. The Guards' only contribution to medical care was often to provide propaganda lectures to the dying men. This entire architecture of filth, disease, and starvation was the carefully prepared ground for the true war that was to be waged. It was a system designed to strip a man of everything that made him human: his health, his dignity, his sense of community, and ultimately, his hope. The Guards, acting as the architects of this hell, understood a fundamental truth of psychological warfare. Before you can conquer a man's mind, you must first convince him that his body is worthless and his life is meaningless. In the frozen, stinking huts of Camp 5, that lesson was being taught and learned every single day. The Guards, teachers of a twisted gospel, the horrifying conditions in the camps were no accident of war. They were part of the lesson. In this classroom, the Guards were not just brutes or jailers. Instead, they saw themselves as teachers, spreading a new and dangerous gospel. Let's look beyond the surface-level brutality and examine the terrifying ideology that drove the Guards. This ideology was an organized, systematic program of human deconstruction, sanctioned from the very top of the Communist command, Kim Il-sung in North Korea and Mao Zedong in China. The American prisoners were seen as the brainwashed, ignorant products of a corrupt and dying capitalist system. The stated goal, therefore, was not to punish them, but to re-educate them, to liberate their minds from the lies of Western imperialism and convert them to the righteous cause of communism. An Hak-sop, a former North Korean official who defected years after the war, provided crucial insights into this chilling mindset. The prison guards and camp instructors were not chosen for their physical strength or military prowess. They were selected for their unwavering political fervor and their skill as propagandists. They were graduates of their own political school, where they were indoctrinated with a specific worldview. They were taught that the American prisoners were both contemptible war criminals and pitiable victims. This ideological framework transformed the act of torture into a moral and political duty. In the minds of the Guards, every beating, every starvation diet, every psychological trick was not an act of cruelty, but a necessary and justifiable part of the re-education process. It was treatment designed to break down the prisoners' resistance so that their mind would be open to the truth of communism. This belief system allowed ordinary men to commit extraordinary acts of inhumanity, all while believing they were on the right side of history. The central pillar was the indoctrination lecture. For hours every day, the POWs were forced to assemble, often sitting on the frozen ground in sub-zero temperatures, while a Chinese or North Korean officer, the instructor, droned on. The topics were always the same: the inherent evils of capitalism, the oppression of the working class in America, the glories of the Soviet Union under Stalin, and the irrefutable historical march toward a global communist victory. The lectures were deliberately repetitive and mind-numbingly boring. This was a psychological tactic. The goal was to mentally exhaust the prisoners, to batter their minds with slogans and propaganda until their capacity for critical thought was worn down. After the lectures, the men were broken into smaller squads and forced to have discussions about the material. They were given propaganda texts to read, pamphlets and books filled with Marxist-Leninist theory, and were required to memorize and recite passages. If a prisoner didn't take part with enough enthusiasm, he was punished, usually by losing what little food he had. The second, and more insidious, prong of the attack was the weaponization of guilt through forced confessions. The guards were obsessed with producing propaganda that they could use to demoralize the UN forces and to prove their political points to the world. Their most infamous and ambitious project was the germ warfare campaign. The communists baselessly accused the United States of dropping insects and other biological agents on North Korea to spread disease. To prove this, they needed confessions from captured American pilots. The process of extracting these confessions was a case study in systematic torture. Pilots and high-ranking officers were singled out and taken to special interrogation centers. There, they were subjected to a relentless combination of physical and psychological torment. They were beaten, kept in isolation for months, denied sleep for days, and forced into painful stress positions. They were told that the lives of their fellow prisoners depended on their cooperation. The goal was to push them to a state of such complete mental and physical collapse that signing a fabricated, multi-page document detailing their involvement in a non-existent germ warfare program seemed like a rational choice. These false confessions were blasted over camp radios and printed in propaganda leaflets, spreading doubt and division among the soldiers. The third and arguably most destructive element of the program was the systematic destruction of trust. The guards knew that the greatest source of a soldier's strength is his bond with his comrades, so they set out to deliberately and methodically sever those bonds. They implemented a system that turned the entire camp into a paranoid surveillance state. They divided the prisoner population, both officially and unofficially, into two warring factions: the progressives and the reactionaries. The progressives were those prisoners who showed a willingness to cooperate with the re-education program. They participated eagerly in the discussions, wrote positive responses to the lectures, and publicly renounced their past lives. In return, they were rewarded with slightly larger food rations, lighter work details, and most importantly, access to what little medical care was available. The reactionaries were the defiant ones, the leaders, the staunch anti-communists, the men who clung to the military code of conduct and tried to keep morale up. These men were marked and publicly shamed. They had their food rations were cut, and they were singled out for the most brutal punishments. To earn the coveted status of a progressive, prisoners were heavily encouraged to become informers. They were told it was their revolutionary duty to report on the reactionary activities of their comrades. Did a fellow prisoner make a cynical joke during a lecture? Did someone try to organize a secret prayer group? Did someone hoard a small piece of food? The guards rewarded this betrayal, and the system proved to be diabolically effective. It created an atmosphere of deep and abiding mistrust, poisoning the very air the prisoners breathed. A man could no longer be sure if the person sleeping next to him, the man he had fought alongside, was a brother or a spy. He was truly alone, isolated not just from his country and his family, but from the very men who shared his suffering. It was in this state of profound psychological isolation that they became most vulnerable to the guards' final, terrifying objective: the complete and total collapse of their will to live. The arsenal of pain, a science of suffering. While the overarching goal of the North Korean camps was psychological conversion, the guards had a vast and terrifying arsenal of physical tactics to enforce their curriculum. The pain inflicted in these camps was the direct, tangible consequence of being labeled a reactionary. It was the lever used to pry open a man's mind for indoctrination, and it was the ultimate tool used to extract the false confessions that were the lifeblood of the enemy's propaganda machine. One of the most common and psychologically devastating methods of torture was the use of stress positions. This was a form of slow-motion agony designed to inflict excruciating pain over a prolonged period without necessarily leaving the obvious marks of a severe beating. A prisoner would be forced to stand at rigid attention for hours, sometimes for days at a time, without being allowed to move, sleep, or sit. Any wavering or collapse would result in a sharp blow from a guard. Another variation was forcing a man to hold his arms straight out to his sides, sometimes with heavy rocks placed in his hands, until his muscles burned with an all-consuming fire and he collapsed, only to be kicked and forced back into the position. This technique was mostly used for punishing minor infractions or for breaking down a prisoner's resistance during the initial stages of interrogation. Beatings were a daily currency of power and control within the camps. They were administered with a brutal variety of implements: rifle butts, wooden clubs, leather straps, and bare fists. But unlike simple acts of rage, these beatings were often highly ritualized and purposeful. A prisoner accused of a rule violation, a reactionary statement, or an attempt to steal food would be dragged before a kangaroo court. Here, in a piece of political theater, he would be publicly denounced, often by progressive prisoners who were forced to participate to prove their loyalty to the captors. After the verdict, the man would be tied to a post or thrown to the ground and savagely beaten. This public spectacle served a dual purpose. It punished the individual with extreme prejudice, and it implicated the entire group in the brutality, further shredding the social fabric and reinforcing the guards' absolute authority. For more serious interrogations, especially those aimed at extracting germ warfare confessions, the guards had more intimate and diabolical methods. One of the most infamous was the use of bamboo splinters. The prisoner's hands would be bound, and the interrogator would take thin, needle-sharp slivers of bamboo and methodically force them under the man's fingernails. The unique, blinding pain was described by survivors as being almost beyond human endurance. Another technique was the water cure, a form of controlled drowning. The prisoner would be held down with a cloth placed over his face, and water would be poured over it, simulating the sensation of drowning. Or a hose would be forced into his mouth and his stomach filled with water until he gets bloated, after which a guard would jump on his stomach, forcing the water out in a violent rush. This process would be repeated for hours, leaving the victim physically wrecked and psychologically terrified. The natural environment of Korea itself was weaponized. In the brutal winters, exposure to the cold became a favored form of punishment. A man would be stripped naked, or down to his underwear, and forced to stand outside in the open for an entire night as temperatures plunged far below zero. Sometimes, guards would douse him with buckets of water, which would freeze instantly to his skin, encasing him in a sheet of ice. Frostbite was inevitable. Men lost fingers, toes, ears, and noses. Many who survived this ordeal were left with permanent, crippling injuries. In the scorching summer months, the opposite was true. A prisoner would be tied to a stake in the middle of the camp, under the direct, blazing sun, without water for days. He would be left to bake, tormented by thirst and insects, until he's unconscious. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging tool in the arsenal was the use of extreme isolation. This took the form of the sweat box or the hole. These were not traditional solitary confinement cells. They were small, dark, earthen pits or wooden crates, often buried in the ground. They were deliberately constructed to be too small for a man to either stand up straight or lie down fully. A prisoner would be forced inside, and a lid would be sealed over the top, plunging him into absolute darkness and near total silence. He would be left in this cramped, coffin-like space for days, sometimes weeks, with only a minimal amount of food and water passed down to him. Marine Corps POW Charles Chick Lane, a survivor of these conditions, gave extensive accounts of how this total isolation was designed to induce hallucinations, paranoia, and a complete mental breakdown. Men would emerge from the hole as disoriented, broken shells of their former selves. Every one of these acts, from a seemingly simple stress position to the abject horror of the whole, was a carefully calibrated instrument in the guards' orchestra of pain. They were the tools used to batter a man into a state of such profound suffering and exhaustion that the idea of parroting a propaganda slogan, of putting his name to a false confession, of betraying a comrade, seemed like a small, rational price to pay for just a moment of peace, a single extra bite of food, or the simple cessation of pain. Give up itis, the soul's disease. The beatings could break a man's bones. The starvation could waste away his flesh. The cold could steal his limbs. But the most effective and terrifying killer in the North Korean prison camps was a disease of the soul. In the detached clinical language of modern medicine, the condition is known as psychogenic death, or marasmus, a state of severe apathy and malnutrition leading to physical decline. But the American POWs who watched it claim their friends and comrades had their own, more chillingly accurate term for it: give-up-itis. It was a silent, creeping epidemic, so common and so deadly that it became one of the defining horrors of the Korean War captivity experience. It was the final, tragic graduation ceremony of the Guard School for Dehumanization. A man with give-up-itis had simply decided to die. It was a quiet and terrifying process that began subtly. A soldier who had perhaps endured months or even years of captivity would become withdrawn and listless. He would stop participating in the secret whispers of resistance as his eyes lose spark. He would sit alone, staring blankly at the mud wall of the hut. Then the physical symptoms would manifest. He would refuse to eat the meager rations of millet or sorghum that were the only thing keeping him alive, and then turn his face to the wall when a comrade tried to help. Soon after, he would stop moving altogether. He would lie down on the dirt floor, curl into a fetal position, and pull a dirty blanket over his head. He would lie in his own filth, making no effort to move or clean himself. His comrades would try to rouse him, to talk to him, sometimes even to slap him to provoke a response. But they would be met with a profound, unnerving emptiness. His eyes, if they could get him to open them, would be vacant, as if he were already looking past them, into another world. There was no specific physical ailment that could be diagnosed. His body was starving, yes, and he was likely suffering from multiple diseases, but so was everyone else. The root cause was not in his flesh, but in his mind. He had lost the will to live. He had surrendered. Within a few days, sometimes a week, he would be dead. The entire prison camp system, from the death marches to the daily indoctrination, was a factory for producing this disease. Give-up-itis was not a random occurrence. It was the logical and intended conclusion of the Guards' relentless, systematic assault on the human psyche. It was the final victory of their program. The prisoners were sealed off from the outside world. Their only source of information was the Guards, who relentlessly fed them a diet of demoralizing lies. They were told that the war had been lost, that South Korea and Japan had fallen, that the United States was in the grip of a communist revolution, and that they had been completely forgotten by their country and their families. With no letters from home, no Red Cross parcels, and no end to the war in sight, the future became an endless, gray, featureless expanse of suffering. Without a date of release to cling to, without a single ray of hope, the will to endure began to crumble. Finally, there was the total loss of purpose and identity. These men were soldiers, sailors, and Marines. They were trained to be active, to have a mission, to fight for a cause. In the camps, their agency was stripped away. They were rendered completely passive, and their every action, from waking to sleeping, were dictated by the arbitrary and often cruel whims of their captors. Their identity as proud American fighting men was relentlessly attacked every single day in the indoctrination lectures. The Guards told them they were not heroes. They were war criminals and imperialist aggressors. When a man loses his purpose, his identity, and his hope for the future, he begins to lose his reason for living. And that is when he becomes vulnerable to the whisper of despair that tells him the only way to end the suffering is to surrender to it completely. The American doctors among the POWs were horrified by give-up-itis. It defied their medical training. They could find no cure because it wasn't a medical problem. They recognized it for what it was, a total psychological collapse. They knew the only possible treatment was psychological, to try to break through the man's wall of apathy, to give him a reason to hold on. But in most cases, once a man had made that final internal decision to die, there was no bringing him back. The secret war, resistance in the heart of hell. Even in the darkest, most hopeless corners of Camp 5, amidst the filth, the starvation, and the constant threat of death, The flame of the human spirit was never fully extinguished. While many men tragically succumbed to the overwhelming pressures of captivity, a dedicated corps of American officers and NCOS waged a secret, silent, and incredibly dangerous war against their captors. This was not a war of open rebellion or dramatic escape attempts in the heavily guarded camps. This was a war of the mind, fought for the highest stakes, to keep their honor, their command, and even the souls of their men. The leaders of this resistance were often the senior officers who, through an almost superhuman display of fortitude, refused to be broken. Men like Marine Corps officer Captain Raymond L. Murphy became the backbone of this internal war. They understood with perfect clarity that the Guard's primary strategic objective was to create chaos and disorganization. The first and most crucial act of resistance, therefore, was to covertly re-establish the military chain of command. This was a profound act of defiance. In secret, officers gave orders, and enlisted men followed them. Squads and platoons were reorganized, all under the noses of the Guards. This simple act was transformative. It restored a sense of order, purpose, and most importantly, identity to the men. They were no longer a random, terrified mob of individuals. They were, once again, soldiers in the United States military, with a duty to resist and a responsibility to each other. With a secret command structure in place, they could begin to actively fight back. Communication was the lifeblood of this resistance. The Guards did everything in their power to isolate the men, moving them between huts and punishing any unauthorized communication. But the POWs developed a host of ingenious methods to maintain their secret network. They used a tap code, communicating between huts by tapping rhythms on walls or the shared heating pipes. They created a coded language of coughs and gestures. They left hidden messages, written on tiny scraps of toilet paper with slivers of graphite taken from pencils, in prearranged dead drops around the camp. This secret information highway allowed them to warn each other about newly identified informers, to share intelligence gathered from newly arrived prisoners, and to coordinate their unified strategy for dealing with the captors. One of their primary missions was the sabotage of the indoctrination program. Since they could not openly refuse to attend the lectures, they undermined them from within. They feigned stupidity, driving the instructors to distraction by asking an endless stream of circular, nonsensical questions about communist theory. They would deliberately mispronounce the names of communist leaders or sing propaganda songs slightly, but noticeably off-key. When forced to write self-criticisms or essays about the lectures, they would fill them with absurd, over-the-top praise that subtly mocked the entire process. These small, constant acts of intellectual rebellion were vital for morale. They were a way for the men to prove to themselves and to each other that while the Guards controlled their bodies, they did not and could not control their minds. The most important and desperate front in this secret war, however, was the direct fight against captivity. The resistance leaders recognized the psychological disease as the enemy's most lethal weapon, so they organized a camp-wide, covert public health initiative to combat it. They established a buddy system, assigning stronger men to watch over those who were beginning to show the first signs of withdrawal and despair. They would physically force these men to get up, to clean themselves, to eat their meager rations. They would talk to them for hours, trying to break through the wall of apathy, reminding them of their families back home, of their duty as soldiers to survive, and of the moral imperative to live, to tell the world the truth about what was happening in these camps. This work was incredibly dangerous. To be identified by the Guards as a reactionary leader was to be marked for death. These men were singled out for the most brutal torture the Guards could devise. They were thrown into the hole for months at a time. They were starved and beaten in a relentless effort to break them and destroy their influence. U.S. Army officer James N. Rowe, who endured years of this targeted brutality before making a daring escape, became a living legend of the secret war. He learned to play the long, agonizing game of survival and defiance, enduring unimaginable pain while secretly continuing to lead his men. The resistance did not save everyone. The death toll in the camps remained horrifically high, but for the thousands of men who did survive, this secret war was everything. It was the structure that kept their world from collapsing into chaos. It was the lifeline that pulled many back from the brink of despair. And it was the ultimate proof that even in the face of a meticulously designed system of human deconstruction, the core of the human spirit, the will to be free, the loyalty to one's comrades, and the simple, stubborn refusal to be broken, could endure. The war after the war, reckoning and a bitter legacy. In the summer of 1953, the armistice was signed, and the program to repatriate prisoners, Operation Big Switch, began. For the American survivors, the gates of hell were finally opening. But they were not returning to the same world they had left, and they were not the same men. Their war was over, but a new, more confusing battle was just beginning. As the first groups of repatriated POWs were brought to the exchange point at Panmunjom, the world got its first shocking look at the physical cost of their captivity. The newsreel footage showed skeletal figures in ill-fitting uniforms, men with a haunted thousand-yard stare, many of them limping on frostbitten feet or suffering from the visible signs of malnutrition and disease. But the deepest and most lasting wounds were the ones that couldn't be seen. Their homecoming was not the simple, triumphant welcome they had dreamed of during their darkest hours. They returned to an America that was shocked, confused, and deeply suspicious. As their stories began to emerge, the nation was gripped by a kind of moral panic. This was not a straightforward narrative of heroic endurance. It was a messy, disturbing, and morally ambiguous story, filled with new and terrifying words that entered the American lexicon. Brainwashing, collaboration, give up IDs, and turncoats. The crisis found its public face in the story of the 23 American soldiers who, at the end of the war, initially refused repatriation, choosing to stay with their communist captors. This act, though it involved a tiny fraction of the prisoners, was a stunning propaganda blow to the United States. It seemed to validate the communist claim that they had re-educated the prisoners and shown them the superiority of their system. When men like Corporal Edward Dickinson later changed their minds and decided to return, they were thrown into the heart of a political firestorm. In a nation in the grips of the Red Scare, with Senator Joe McCarthy hunting for communists in every corner of the government, the U.S. Army felt an immense pressure to prove that it was not soft on communism. As former POW Johnny Moore would later write, the Army needed a sacrifice, and Ed Dickinson unknowingly sat in the waiting. Dickinson was arrested, put on trial, and court-martialed for collaborating with the enemy. His trial and the trials of other accused collaborators ripped the comforting veil off the POW narrative. The American public and the military were forced to confront a series of agonizing and, for a time, unanswerable questions. Were these men who had signed propaganda petitions or made radio broadcasts under duress traitors who deserved to be punished? Or were they victims of an insidious new form of mental warfare that they were utterly unprepared to fight? One side of the debate saw a fundamental breakdown of the American character. Influential figures like Army psychiatrist Major William E. Mayer argued that the soldiers who fought in Korea were a strikingly different group of human beings from those who fought in World War II, lacking the moral fiber and mental fortitude to endure the pressures of captivity. This view was bolstered by journalistic investigations, like Virginia Pasley's book, 21 Stayed, which delved into the backgrounds of the non-repatriates and found that most came from broken homes, were impoverished, and had little education. The conclusion was chilling. The POW's failure was a symptom of a deeper illness in American society. They feared that millions of other young Americans raised in a permissive, post-war world were just as vulnerable to communist brainwashing. This profound national anxiety led to one of the most significant and enduring legacies of the Korean War. In 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, responding directly to the crisis, signed Executive Order 10,631, creating the U.S. Military Code of Conduct. For the first time, American service members were given a clear, simple, and powerful ethical framework for surviving captivity. Its 6 articles were a direct response to the horrors of the North Korean camps, giving future soldiers the ideological armor that the Korean War POWs had so tragically lacked. The code was a stark admission that the rules of war had been irrevocably changed, and that the modern battlefield now extended deep into the recesses of the human mind. But as the nation debated the guilt of the living and tried to learn the lessons of their ordeal, a far darker and more disturbing secret lay buried in the classified archives of the Pentagon. The true crisis wasn't just about the men who came home broken, or the handful who refused to come back at all. It was about the men who never came back and were deliberately left behind. Years after the war in 1996, a series of declassified government documents brought a horrifying secret to light. The documents showed that in December of 1953, months after the final prisoner exchanges of Operation Big Switch, the U.S. Defense Department knew that more than 900 American troops were confirmed to be alive at the end of the war, but were never released by the North Koreans. These men were not listed as missing in action. They were confirmed survivors, alive, in enemy hands. The United States government had this knowledge, but in the cold, pragmatic calculus of the Cold War, a decision was made. These 900 men and the families who would wait for them forever were sacrificed for a fragile armistice. They were abandoned, erased from the record, and left to become ghosts inside the world's most secretive and brutal state. This final, bitter truth casts a long and dark shadow over the legacy of the Korean War. For the American survivors who did make it home, the war never truly ended. And for their South Korean comrades, the tragedy was different, but just as profound. The North Koreans never even afforded them the status of prisoners of war. They were liberated fighters, conscripted into forced labor units. They were never repatriated. After the armistice, they were given the lowest caste citizenship in North Korea's rigid social system and sent to work and die in the coal mines, forever branded by their past.